Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Samach Aleph. This week's learning is sponsored by Rina Septi Goldstein and Mark Goldstein in loving memory of Mo Septi, a wonderful man. Today's daf is sponsored by Hadron Zoom Learners in honor of Julie Mendelson. Mazel tov on the birth of your first granddaughter. In Menachot, as we learn in Menachot about the Korban Reshit, an offering that symbolizes a special beginning, may your first new granddaughter bring blessing, joy, and nachat, just like a special first. Mazel tov. Okay, we're going to get started with the bottom of Samach Hamid. I want to go back, and her name is Gili. That's Mazel Tov Gili. Thank you for the live updates. Okay, we're going to get started with Rabbi Shimon. I want to go back and just start the sugya with the bottom of yesterday's daf because it's easier to read the whole thing as one flow, and you'll see exactly what's happening. So we start at the bottom of Samach Amabet, and we're in the middle of a bright, and we bring divrei Rabbi Shimon, which, if you remember, Rabbi Shimon disagreed in the Mishna, particularly about the mincha kohen and the mincha kohen Mashiach, and said basically those two that, according to Tanakama, they're in the list of, okay, let's remind us what we're up to, needs hagasha, you need to bring it to the altar, but there's no tenufa, okay? So he takes those off the list, and he says those don't need hagasha, okay? And that's because they have no kmitza, right? There's no part separated out of them. Okay, now we're going to see Rabbi Shimon, who darshans a little bit differently the words et hamincha. If you remember in the beginning of the daf, yesterday, or the beginning of this section, we had et hamincha meant to say we're including one additional one besides the minchat soled in the first five that need hagasha, also the minchat chote. But Rabbi Shimon says et hamincha actually includes way more than that, okay? Which it's not clear what more than that. He says mincha et mincha comes to include all the other minachot. Okay, but we're going to say, he's going to have to say, except for this, except for that, except for that. So we're going to have three exceptions. But basically, I want you to understand that we're starting from a different place. According to the rabbis, Tanakama's position, et mincha came to include the mincha chote, and then we have separate ones to include other ones. And whatever's not included is not included because there was no reason to include them. Rabbi Shimon's starting from the other perspective. We're going to include everything unless we have a reason to exclude. And now he's going to need three exclusions to exclude three categories. Two, the rabbis agree with. It's just like I said, they don't need a special drasha for it because there's no reason to think they're in the category. He's going to have to exclude them, okay? And then he's going to have to exclude the ones he excludes personally, right? Just him, the kohen and the kohen Mashiach. Okay, so that's what we're basically doing here. So I'll start again from the Braita. Rabbi Shimon Omer, et hamincha lerabot shar menachot lahagasha. So once I include all the menachot, so now you might think also the shtei alechem and the lechem hapanim are in. So Talmud Lamar me'ela. Now what he's going to do with each one is two parts. Number one, he's going to say which word excludes it. We're going to have me'ela, we're going to have vihikriva, and vihigisha. And that's going to basically exclude all three categories. Then, for each one, we're going to have to say, okay, it's nice you have a word that says from these, meaning not all of them, but why, if you're going to exclude something, are those the ones that get excluded? And for that, we're going to have an explanation. Okay, so why specifically lechem hapanim is out from the laws of hagasha? Because all the other menachot get burned. None of them gets burned, right? They get completely eaten by the kohanim, as opposed to the other menachot where part gets burned, part gets eaten by the kohanim. Okay, and then we're going to talk about what about the ones that get completely burned. But right now, we're just on the idea that things get burned. Okay, and therefore, we're going to assume that whatever's in the words et hamincha include have to be similar to the mincha in the sense that something of it gets burned. So those two are out. Second category. Now, the way we're going to get to each next category is, okay, wait, but something doesn't jive with what you're saying. Because if you say, if it gets burned, then it's in. Well, what about the libation, mincha? That gets burned, and yet it's off the list. Why is it off the list? Right? Maybe it's in the list because it gets burned. Part of, right? Actually, the whole thing there gets burned. Talmud Lomar, vihikriva. It says vihikriva, which is a limitation that's going to limit minchat nesachim. So then they say, v'ha'afikte. What do you mean? We already used the word hikriva, remember? That was Rabbi Shimon specifically darshan v'hikriva to say that's how we get and now I have to remember which one he was in, It's either the mincha sota. I think he said something else. Okay, anyway, he used it for a different drasha. Right now it's not in my head and I don't want to waste our time in it. You can look earlier in the daf. But he uses hikriva for something else. So now they say, it's the sota. It is the sota. Okay, I just checked. Rashi says it. Vihikriva. So they say, oh no, don't let that bother us. We're still at the very bottom of Samach Hamabed. I'm just using this to set up what we're going to, the whole section. Hikriva. The word hikriv is the one that tells us about the sota. But hikriva is saying specifically this and not something else. Okay, because hikriva in Hebrew is made up of two words, hikriv, ota. So it's from the ota, which means this and not something else. Now we need the explanation though. But why is nisachim out? Okay, now we start our daf. We get to where we left off yesterday, which is why mincha nisachim though is out. What's the reason? Well, the logic is it's completely different because it doesn't come on for its own sake. It's not like a mincha that I say I'm bringing a mincha or a mincha that's supposed to be brought on its own. This is a unique mincha that's brought only because I'm bringing a sacrifice and it goes along with the sacrifice. So that is not part of this. Again, it's an easy way to get it. Say, if there's an exception, it would be that one. Okay, so now that's going to lead us, same way the last one led us to, well, why not mincha nesachim? That fits that category. Well, what about the mincha kohanim, mincha kohen Mashiach? Mincha kohanim, which again is a voluntary offering brought by a kohen. Any kohen who brings a voluntary offering, remember, the whole thing gets burned. It's different than a Yisrael. And mincha kohen Mashiach is the chavitin that they bring twice a day. They are ba'ot biglal atzman. So why did Rabbi Shimon use them as exceptions to the rule and say they don't need hagasha? Yachol yutu no hagasha. Maybe they do need hagasha based on this logic, right? It gets burned. It comes on its own. Talmud lomal vihigisha. So here's our third word. We have me'elef from these, not all of these. Hikriva, this one, not the others. And higisha, this one, not the others. They said, what do you mean? You can't take the word itself where we're darshaning everything from. Higisha, this word, or not darshaning, but this is the main basis of saying you have to bring it to the altar. You can't say that word is unnecessary. Without that word, we wouldn't even have the laws of hagasha. How can you say it's needed for itself, for the basic simple reading? You can't darshan it if it's needed for itself. So again, they're going to say the exact same thing they said before. Mean vihigish, vihigisha. It could have just said vihigish el hamizbeach. That would have taught you need to do hagasha. But the fact that it adds the hey at the end with a dot in it, right, which means ota, higish ota, that one is going to be brought. That is a limiting word. And now we finally end this whole thing with Uma ra'ita l'rabot shar menachot u'lutzim mincha kohanim mincha kohen Mashiach. Now we have to explain why is this uniquely different from the regular mincha that we're going to exclude it. Because again, higisha is a random exclusion. It's not connected with, we're specifically excluding the mincha kohen and the mincha kohen Mashiach. In order to answer this question, and this is why I really wanted to start from the beginning, they review the whole thing. Okay, so now they go and they say like this. Marbe ani shar menachot. I'm only including other menachot sheyesh mehen liishim, that number one, get burned on the fire. Ba'ot biglal atzmam, they come on account of themselves, not because they're part of some other korban. V'yesh mehem lekohanim. That's the third one that's important for our purposes for this last question, which is the kohanim get part of it. Okay, the kohanim don't get any part of the mincha kohanim and the mincha kohen Mashiach, kind of ironically, right? Because they're brought by kohanim, and yet the kohanim get no part of them. The remainder doesn't go to the kohanim. Umotzi ani et shtei alechem. So now we're going to go through the whole list. Shtei alechem and lechem apanim are out, she'en mehem liishim, because they don't get burned. Mincha nesachim, she'en haba biglal atzma. It doesn't come on its own. Mincha kohanim, mincha kohen Mashiach, she'en mehem lekohanim, because the kohanim don't get anything. Okay, and with that we finish Rabbi Shimon. So again, just to point out, the first two in the list of three, I mean it's more than three, because in each one there's more than one, or at least some of them have more than one. There's three categories of Rabbi Shimon. The first two the rabbis agree with. There's no disagreement about it. It's just he comes up with how they're excluded. What's different about it is what I said in the beginning. Once he includes everything, they need to be excluded. The rabbis didn't think we include everything. The rabbis thought Ed mincha just includes the mincha chote, not all other menachot. And then there's no reason to find exceptions. There's like two different methods of darshaning. One is, if it doesn't say it and we don't have a special drasha, then it's not there, right? Then we're not going to. So, and the rabbis just said there's no drasha to include everything, so I don't need to exclude them. He was of a different approach that et came to include a lot of things, and then we have to one by one take out each one. And then he used all these words that say, this and not that, that, not that, that, not that, with the explanation as to why specifically he took out that category. So the first two categories they agree about, just not about the way we got to the answer as to why these are out and not in. But the third one is his unique halacha, which is the rabbis had mincha kohen and mincha kohen Mashiach on the list. They didn't. Okay. Now we're moving on to one last thing before we get to the next Mishnah. I moved to tenufa instead of hagasha, which is because right now we're in the list of all the ones that need hagasha. They need to be brought to the altar, but don't need tenufa. So we didn't talk about tenufa yet. Waving. That's going to be our topic of the next Mishnah. Now, it's a little seemingly out of order here. Probably they're bringing this because the next pasuk after the one, the higisha, in chapter 2, verse 8 of Vayikra, is verse 9. And in verse 9 it says, Veherim hakohen min mincha. He takes from the mincha, this is the kmitza, et azkarata, viktir mizbecha, and then he burns it. Now the word veherim, notice it doesn't say with a kometz, okay, with his hand, right, with his hands. So they say yachol b'kli. Maybe you think the kohen could do it with a vessel, right? The best way to do it, let's say your handful is a certain measurement that needs to go be burned. Measure it in a measuring utensil and take it to the altar to burn. Talmud Lamal, they quote a pasuk in Perek Vav. Okay, this is again good to remember because we're coming up on this in Parshat Shavua next week. Starting Vayikra, in the beginning, it's all to Bnei Israel, and then it's the same mitzvah, but repeated to the kohanim from their perspective. So chapter 6 talks about the Menachot that we talked about in chapter 2, all those minchat nedava that we talked about, solet, right? Ma'afet tanur, machva marcheshet, and then says, ve'rim mimenu bekumtso. There it says with his kmitza. First of all, that was tying to the kohanim. It makes sense that we get more into detail, okay? But that's not what the Gemara is going to say here. What do they say is, okay, now, here it just said hirim. There it says bekumtso. Just like the harama there is with the kometz, also here it's with the kometz. This is a little strange. It's a strange drasha because obviously if it says there, do it with the kometz, it's talking about, like what I just said, it's telling the kohanim how to do it. Obviously, when they talk about harama here, it's obviously with kometz, if it's talking about the same kind of korbanot. But here, if you notice, okay, let's just remember the order. It went from solet, which is the regular dough, when you're taking the kometz when it's just dough. But then it moved to ma'afet tanur, the ones baked first. Then it went to the ones that are in the pan, and the flat pan, and then in the deep pan. And after all those was this pasuk. Now, those are a little different when it comes to doing the kmitza. And now, in Vayikra Vav, when it talked about it, it was specifically the minchat solet, which is just raw dough. Before you do the kometz, you do the kometz when it's raw. Now, there was a thought, and this is why this drasha had to come, that there it said it with the solet. With the solet, you would do it with your hand, because it's very easy to do with your hand. Remember we talked about how hard kmitza is? The reason why kmitza is hard is difficult in one of the cases where before you take the kometz, you bake it or fry it or do something to it, whereas it's already hardened, and now you have to basically break it into smaller pieces, take a kometz, and make sure you have exactly a handful. Now, if you have chunks, it's not so easy. Some people say actually that it's because of the mincha. That case is easy, where you don't even have water in it, or very little water, and it's like much powder, much more, not powdery, but granules like that, and they'll fall out. Either which way, there's some case that's much more complicated to do, and what they're suggesting here is that might be the case that you think it's talking about here. That the hirim maybe would be measured out in a vessel, because it's kind of impossible to do it without a vessel and get the exact right amount, not too much, not too little. But comes the drasha to say, no, in all the cases you have to do it by hand, you can't do it with a vessel, despite the fact that it's difficult. And if you remember, we talked about this, one of the avodot kashot in the mikdash that the kohanim had to do was this kmitza. And again, it's not when it's just a dough, that's pretty easy. It's when it's not a dough, and you do the kmitza, that's challenging. Okay, now we move to the next Mishnah. Now, I mentioned yesterday that the order was a little strange, right? We started in the Shemin and Levona with yes, yes, one not the other not one, and then ended with none, none. Our Mishnah went in a bit of a weird order. It started with yes, hagasha, not tenufa. Then it went to both. Then it went to the tenufa, not hagasha, and then it went to neither. And I suggested that probably they wanted to start with the one that had the longer list and the list that matched the first list for the most part, with just one minor difference, to the previous Mishna of the Shemin and Levona. But it was a little weird, right? And then basically they moved that one and left, right, the rest of the order the way it was. But when you get to this Mishnah, you realize, and in fact, then I noticed there was a note by the Mishnah that we read yesterday, that in some of the versions of the Mishnah, it actually goes one and not the other not one, all, none. Okay? And this Mishnah clearly proves that order. Because you would have expected, based on the order we said yesterday, again, where it's kind of like topic sentence, there's 4 categories, and it listed the 4 categories, and the second was hagasha tenufa, but some versions change it, and based on our next Mishnah. Because the next Mishnah starts off, which we're going to start right now, elu tunot tenufa ve'ein tunot hagasha. You would have expected these are the ones that need both, because that was the order we started in. But they go right now to the ones that need waving and not hagasha, not bringing to the altar. Okay, so that's just a note in terms of the order here and possible problem with the version of the previous Mishnah. So now we're in our list of what requires waving and not bringing to the altar. Log shemen shel mitzora v'ashamo. If you remember, the mitzora, one of the things they have to bring is a korban asham, and they bring it with a log of oil, and they bring them and they wave them. Okay, that actually says explicitly in the pasuk, which is probably why they started with this. Habikurim, we'll see the pasuk soon, so I won't read it now. Habikurim kedivrei Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Bikurim according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Okay, I'll already tell you what's going to happen in the Gemara, which they're going to say. Okay, what this basically means is bikurim need to be waved according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. It sounds like not everyone agrees. The Gemara is going to say, what about Rabbi Yehuda? He also says it. Why'd you skip him in the Mishnah? So we'll get back to that. We'll see the drasha of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. We'll see the drasha of Rabbi Yehuda, and then we'll figure out why they skipped Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah. This is the korban shlamim, a regular korban shlamim that an individual brings, a peace offering. So you take the imurim, which are the parts that are supposed to be burned on the altar, and you wave them with the chazeh and the shok, which is the chest and the thigh, which goes to the kohen. Okay, so the imurim are going to go on the altar, the chazeh and the shok are going to be given to the kohen. You have to wave them all together. Who brings the shlamim has to do this? Echad anashim ve'echad nashim. Both men and both women are obligated. But b'Yisrael v'lo ba'achirim. Now, this is a strange sentence. It's not clear what it means. The Gemara is going to assume it means a Yisrael does it, meaning a male, but not a female, which is very strange. Didn't we just say the female's obligated? So we're going to have to wait till the Gemara to explain to us how to read this. Okay, next one on the list. So we did the log shemen of the mitzorah with the asham. We did the bikurim. We did the shlamim, the parts of the shlamim that get waved. Now we have the shtei alechem u'shnei kivsei atzeret. Okay, so the 2 loaves together with the 2 sheep. Ketzad oseh, so how is that waved? Noten shtei alechem al gabei shnei kvasim. This is something we're going to get much more into the next stuff, which is they're going to talk about how we know the order of this whole thing. That the bread goes on top of the sheep. Umeniach shtei yadav lamat, and he puts 2 of his 2 hands below. Molich umevi ma'aleh u'morid. And then there's 4 motions, which are possibly 6. We'll also talk about that tomorrow, which is forward, backwards, and up, down. Shenemal, where do we get that there's these 4 motions? Asher hunaf v'asher huram. So first of all, there's the word hanafa in the pasuk, and there's the word harama in the pasuk. Okay? And you're saying like the lulav, wait till tomorrow's daf. Yes, like the lulav. Okay? But we'll talk about that. That's why we're going to get to 6 in the end. But we'll wait and see. Okay, so now, where does it say asher hunaf asher huram? This is actually in the shlamim pasuk. Okay, this is how you wave in general. This isn't just for the shtei alechem and the shnei kvasim. It's how you do the waving. Now, it says, it actually doesn't tell you the whole thing, and Rashi tells you more, which is, before that, okay, I mean, Rashi, dibor matchil asher hunaf asher huram, ula el minei ktiv. By the way, this is all, I'll tell you, this is all in a korban shlamim they brought in the miluim. Okay, we read it not so long ago in the Parsha. It was in Shmot Perek Kaftet, and it talked about on the day they sanctify the Mishkan, this is what they're supposed to bring. And it says there, Hey nafta otam tenufa, which is 2, Hey nafta tenufa. And then a few psukim later, it says, Asher hunaf, asher huram. And they assume laharim is connected with the tenufa. So there's 4 languages of tenufa, which means 4 actions. Molich, mevi, forward, back, maleh, morid, up, down. Okay, and that's how they get to 4 from the drasha on those 4 words. Tenufa, we'll learn more about this in the next stuff. Tenufa hayta b'mizrach v'hagasha b'ma'arav. Now, even though we're not talking about hagasha, but they're telling you there's post hagasha, which is done in the west side of the altar. You do the hagasha we talked about in the southwest corner because it says el pnei hamizbeach, facing the altar, which is from the south as you go up the ramp. And Lifnei Hashem is outside the heichal, which is at the west side, because remember the east side is where you walk in, the heichal is on the west. So you do that, and that's the closest to where God's presence is in the Kodesh Kodeshim. So you're going to do the hagasha b'ma'arav, but the tenufa is in the east. Now Rashi says, even in the east, you could do it on the west also, but the tenufa could be done also on the east side of the courtyard. Now, Rambam has a weird interpretation here, which is a question. Why he says this? He says specifically in the east. Okay? We're not going to really deal with the Rambam, but I want you to know that Rambam's opinion exists. Rashi's makes a lot more sense here. We'll see as we get into the Gemara and see where we get that it can be in the Mizrach. Tenufot, because it also, I'll tell you just the main thing is, it also says Lifnei Hashem. And if Lifnei Hashem we usually say is west, you have to explain how Lifnei Hashem here means even in the east. Now you have to remember, anywhere you are in the temple courtyard, even on the east side, is before God, right? You're much closer to before God than you are outside. So it could still be included in Lifnei Hashem. The question is really, why is hagasha specifically on the west, and this one could be even in the east? Okay, next. That's why the Rambam is a little difficult to say specifically in the east, and it can't be in the west, right? You would think all the more so you could do it in the more sacred place. Okay, we're getting to our next list now. Tenufot kodmot lahagashot. Now, before we get there, we now kind of say, well, if you have to do tenufa and hagasha, which is our next part of the list, well, the tenufa goes first and then hagasha. What's the minchat ha'omer? Uminchat knaot, tu'unot, hagasha, utnufa. So minchat knaot is the sotah. That's the one where it says it explicitly. You need hanafa, and we also darshan that you need hagasha. And the minchat ha'omer is learned out. Okay, we darshaned yesterday how we get that it needs hagasha, and we'll see later a drasha where how do you know it needs also tenufa. Lechem hapanim uminchat nesachim ein tu'unot lo hagasha velo tenufa. Now we're on the last list. The lechem hapanim and the minchat nesachim neither needs, right? They both need neither of them. Okay, no hagasha, no tenufa. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Now we get to this cute thing of Rabbi Shimon. Since I recorded the Shabbat daf already and it's quoted in tomorrow's daf, I actually dealt with this a little bit more in tomorrow's daf, but I'll explain it briefly here, which is Rabbi Shimon Omer. What I mentioned there, I'll just say it already today, is what's very nice about this kind of statement is in Chulin, he has a Mishna, does the exact same type of thing with a completely different topic, which is he puts us into this number system, or kind of system you'll see in a second. He says, Shlosham Yinim, there's 3 types of korbanot, Tu'unim shalosh mitzvot. There's 3 types of korbanot, there's 3 mitzvot, and each one, what he does is like this. He says, Shtayim b'chol echad u'shlishit ein bahem. With each of the 3 korbanot, they each need 2 out of the 3 mitzvot we're going to list right now, and each one a different 2. Okay? And for each one, there isn't the third. It's like a cute way to remember. Seems more like a mnemonic device that he's using here, because you'll see after, if you catch this, you can really remember it pretty easily. So what are the 3? Eluhain, and it all has to do with waving, which is why it's here. So there's 3. Zivchei shalmei yachid, the shlamim for an individual, peace offering. Zivchei shalmei tzibor, the public shlamim, which is the shnei kivsei atzeret with the shtei alechem, the one on Shavuot. And the 3rd is the asham mitzorah. Okay, they're all mentioned in the first part of our Mishna, right? Now, Zivchei shalmei, now what are the 3 mitzvot? I'll tell you outside before we read it inside in each case, but there's smicha, which we haven't talked about here. Smicha you do on the animal when it's alive. You bear your weight on the animal. So of the 3 mitzvot that each one's going to require 2 out of the 3, there's smicha when the animal's still alive. There's waving when the animal is still alive. Now we didn't talk about this. We talked about waving before, but I don't know if you noticed this. Some of the animals are waved when they're alive, like shnei kivsei atzeret. They're whole. Okay, they're still alive. Some of them are waved when after they're already slaughtered. Like, for example, if you take the imurim and the chazev shok of the shlamim, obviously we're talking about after the animal's dead. Otherwise, you can't just take the imurim and the leg and the right. If you cut them off before, you've killed the animal and it's not slaughtered. So some are before, some are after. And so we're now going to have 3 things. There's smicha while the animal's alive. There's waving when the animal's alive, and there's waving when the animal is no longer alive after it's slaughtered. So each of these have 2 of the 3. So now we have Zivchei Shalmei Yachid Tu'unim Smicha Chayim. So, okay, really regular shlemim, you have to do smicha when the animal's alive. Tenufa shchutim, and that's what I just mentioned. Obviously, if you're doing the chazed and shok and the imurim, it's after the animal's slaughtered. Ve'em behem tenufa chayim, you don't wave it when the animal's alive. Zivchei shalmei tzibur tunim tenufa chayim ushchutim. Okay, the shalmei tzibur, even though the pasuk actually talks about waving specifically the sheep when they're alive, okay, right, what you do is you hold them in your hand with the bread, we'll talk about this tomorrow exactly, and you wave them while they're alive. But they darshan also that you wave them once they're slaughtered. So you're going to have those two, but, okay, so but there's no smicha for that. And Hasham Tzorah, you can already figure out which one this is missing, because it's each one has two and not the third. This one hasn't been mentioned yet. Hasham Tzorah ta'un smicha, u'tnufa chai. You wave it when it's alive, you do smicha when it's alive, but ein bo tnufa shakut. You don't take the animal and wave it when it's dead. Okay, after the slaughtering. So that's just a cute way to remember. He doesn't disagree with anyone, by the way. He's just giving a way to remember. Tanu Rabbanan. So now the Gemara is going to start with the Braita to start teaching us the sources for these halachot. So how do we know the asham and the asham mitzorah, the korban that you bring, korban asham with the log of shemen gets waved. V'ikriv oto la'asham ve'el log shemen v'hinif otam tenufa. Okay, that's the pasuk. Very clear. You wave them. Hinif tenufa is waving them. But what the Braita is going to say is, what's not clear here? Do you wave them together or separately? So they say, well, it says, Hinif otam, them you wave. Sounds like you wave them together. So therefore they say, Melamed shetunim tenufa ke'echad. Sounds like they need to be waved together. Uminayin shemiznif zebatzmo v'zebatzmo yatsa. What if you didn't do it that way? What if you did them each separately? How do you know that it's okay? You'll fulfill your obligation even though it's not ideal. Talmud Lamar, v'ikriv oto la'asham. Well, the beginning said, Hikriv oto la'asham, and then it said, Hinif otam. So it started singular, then it went to plural, so they're going to say, since it's mentioned singular in the pasuk, and they're each kind of mentioned separately in the beginning of the pasuk, you can be yotzei anyway, you can fulfill your obligation. But then they suggest, v'hiniv, when it says in the, if you're going to read the beginning of the pasuk as if they could be done separately, and then hinif otam is together, maybe you're supposed to do hinif, yachol yanif, yachzor v'yanif. Maybe it says hinif, and then otam tenufa. So maybe hinif is do it once, separately, and that's each one separately. Then otam tenufa, then do them together. Talmud Lamar, tenufa v'lo tenufot. No. Because tenufa is written in singular form, from there it's very clear you're supposed to do one waving and not three wavings. Okay, so that doesn't make sense. Okay, so that's how we get the asham mitzorah with the log and how we know that you're supposed to do them together, but yet if you did them separately, you fulfill your obligation anyway. Now they continue in the pasuk. The end of that pasuk is Hinif otam tenufa lifnei Hashem. And now we get to the location. Lifnei Hashem babizrach. Okay, like we said, we'll go with Rashi, even in the east. So now they say V'ha'amalta lifnei Hashem b'ma'arav. Now they skip the important part, which is lifnei Hashem. Their darshaning now is not hagasha of the log mitzorah and that, right, and the asha mitzorah. They're talking about lifnei Hashem in the requirement of hagasha for the mincha. Okay? So when the mincha needs hagasha, and this is what we compared in the Mishna also, their lifnei Hashem is translated as west. Okay, again, it has to be southwest because of the pnei mizbeach, but it has to be west, because south because of el pnei mizbeach, but west because it says lifnei Hashem. So why is it so obvious there that lifnei Hashem is west, and here it could be even east? So the answer, Amre hanemile mincha. That's specifically for the mincha. Here we're not in the mincha, we're in the asham and the log of the mitzorah. In the mincha, it's ikre chatat. Okay, so what? The mincha, it says in the pasuk there, it says that the mincha is kachatat kasham. It's kodesh kodeshim, if you remember, right? It's high level sanctity, and it needs, and it's like a chatat. Because it calls it a chatat, what do we know about a chatat? Chatat tu'una yesod. The chatat needs to be, the remainder of the blood has to be poured in the yesod. Now remember, okay, there's no yesod on the southeast corner. Okay, there's only yesod, if you remember, the yesod goes on two sides. Okay, and then juts out a little bit, but there's no yesod on the southeast corner. So they say, if the chatat needs yesod, and Karen Dromit lo ayalu yesod, there was no yesod on the corner, the southeast corner, And therefore, if the mincha has to be like the chatat, then it has to be done on the west side, not the southeast side. Aval hacha lifnei Hashem krina be. But here it just simply says lifnei Hashem, and the whole azara we're going to assume is lifnei Hashem. Okay, that's why it's very hard to read this to the Rambam that lifnei Hashem specifically means east. Okay, I'm going to leave that as an open question. Now we're going to get to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov and the bikurim. Bikurim, the waving. How do we know? From Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. My Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. So first we have to see what's his drasha. Ditanya velakacha kohen. Okay, this is when you bring the bikurim. It says lakacha kohen hatena biadecha. Okay, he takes the tena that's in your hands. V'hinichol lifnei mizbach Hashem Elokecha, and then he puts it down before the mizbach. So now it says velakacha kohen limed ala bikurim shetunim tenufa derives Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Okay, did you see tenufa in the pasuk? Not really, but it says he learns it from lakach. That we're talking about, it needs tenufa. So now the Gemara helps us and says, okay, my time, or what's his reason to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov? Where does he get it from this pasuk? Because it's not really so clear that it needs tenufa. To which they say, Gamar yad yad mishlamim. It uses the word yad yad, gzereshava. It says miyadecha, and it says yad in the pasuk, this very famous pasuk for where we learn tenufa, Yadav tivienu et ishe Hashem, et hachelev ala chazeh yivienu et hachazeh lahanif oto tenufa lefnei Hashem. This is in the Shlamim. It says your hands should bring it, meaning the owner, should bring it with their hands. What should they bring? The chelev, that's the imurim, and the chazeh, it doesn't say the shok, but they mean the chazeh and the shok here. Lahanif otam tenufa lefnei Hashem, to wave them before God. So now we're going to have a few things from this Zera Shava, but the main one for our purposes is okay, so there you have. There it says yad, here it says yad. We're going to assume this tenufa also by bikurim. But the Braita continue, the Zera Shava continues on Amud Bet now. Makan kohen, af lahalan kohen. Now we're going to lead to some other halacha, which wasn't what we were looking for. But just like now, in the bikurim case, who's lakacha kohen atena miyadecha, it's really the subject is the kohen. Okay? So there it's the kohen doing the action. Umala halam bebal. So then they say, even though by shlamim, who does it? Yadav tivienu vehinif. The subject is, right? In the subject in the bikurim, it's lakacha kohen and then vehinif, right? And here the subject in shlamim is the lakacha yadav tivienu. The baalim bring it and hinif. Sounds like the baalim wave. So they're going to say like this. The Zera Shava learns that both people need to do anafa. Makan kohen aflalan kohen. Just like in bikurim, it's the kohen doing the waving. The kohen also has to do the waving in the shlamim. Uma lahalam baalim. In the shlamim, it's the owner who does it, the owner of the korban. Afkan baalim. Also here, the baalim. Haketzad. So how do you do it? How do both wave? Kohen miniach yado tachat yidei baalim umenif. So the kohen puts his hands under the right. First the kohen, then the hands of the owner, and they wave it together. Okay, that's how it works. This opens a big Pandora's box. Okay, this is a big problem because it's actually the topic of Gefer for this week. Big machlok at Rashi and Tosfot. How do you do that? Because what's the problem? Well, there's a halachic problem here. The kohen is supposed to be directly touching. In order to do anafa, you have to be directly touching it. If the kohen's hands and then the owner's hands, then the kohen's hands aren't touching it, and how can you do that? So there's a big debate how you do it. Some people say it's not really on top of. Tosfot says you hold the sides, and this one holds bottom. But Rashi says you could do one on top of the other. I'm not confusing the opinions, but I think that's the way it goes. And anyway, it leads to a very interesting shur of Rabbi derives, although it's translated into English by Shalhavit Schwartz, about what happens when, how do you deal with the difference between lamdanut and practicality. Okay, there's practical problem with the lamdanut here, and how do you grapple with that? Okay, so that's an interesting shiur to delve into if you have the time. Okay, next. So the point being, because we really brought this specifically for the issue of bikurim needs tenufa, as Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov learned it. But I told you we're going to get into a problem here, because it sounds like he's the only one who holds bikurim needs tenufa. That's why it said bikurim is listed here according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. The lemanami kedivar Rabbi Yehuda. Why don't we say it's also according to Rabbi Yehuda? Tanya, as it says in a bright, to Rabbi Yehuda Omio. Now, I just want to preface this by saying he's going to bring up some problem which really is not such a problem in the simple reading of the text. But he's going to say there's a word v'hinachto, that I'm putting down the bikurim before Hashem, and there's a word v'hinicho, putting down the bikurim before Hashem. And the repetition is going to lead us to say that one of them is tenufa. But before we get there, I want to just read you the psukim. Okay, the word hinicho appears this is all in chapter 26 of Devarim, when it talks about the bikurim. It says in verse 4, "V'lakacha kohen atena miyadecha," that's what we read. "V'hinicho lifnei mizbeach Hashem lokecha." Now, the first drasha, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, was from the word miyadecha. This one's from v'hinicho, and he puts it down. Okay, now puts it down doesn't sound like waving, right? Puts it down. But what are they going to say? Because it repeats it later, okay, which is, now, it's a little bit of a weird repetition, because it's not like it says it, and he puts it down another time. But if you remember, in the bikurim, there's a statement you're supposed to make, a declaration. When you bring the bikurim, it's arami oved avi, right? It's the whole section we say in the Haggadah plus a little more. For example, this pasuk we don't say. This is the veheveti, the fifth lashon of Geula. Okay, atay neheveti et reshit pri adama asher natata li Hashem v'inachto lefnei Hashem elokecha v'shtachaveta lefnei Hashem elokecha. It says, I brought you my bikurim and I put them down. Okay, so now what's interesting about this? I put them down, right? Now, put them down is, here it's a description when the person, it's saying what I did. It's not actually repeated. It's repeated for a reason, saying, here's what I did. So it's not exactly unnecessary, but they view it as unnecessary. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, v'hinachto zo tenufa. So first he just says, the second mention of the word v'hinachto is tenufa. What do you mean? How do you get from there to tenufa? It says hanacha, which means put it down. Who said it says anything about waving? Well, so again, he very simply says, look, it says earlier v'inicho, hare hanacha amur. You already got hanacha from there. Hamani makayem v'hinachto. So why do I say later v'hinachto? Maybe what's also bothering them is the change of the word to instead of v'inicho, hinachto. But zo tenufa. So from there you get that it's tenufa. So that's his drasha. Now the question is, why did we choose Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov and not Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah? Like, why didn't we mention Rabbi Yehuda as well? So Amarava, basically we're going to say they couldn't mention Rabbi Yehuda, they just left him out for some reason. So we're going to have two answers why. Amarava ho'ilu patach bo katuv tchila. Well, he darshaned it from an earlier pasuk, because the hinachto is in a later pasuk. So, okay, I never heard that argument before, but if we have a choice of one or the other, let's pick the one that was from the earlier pasuk. Okay, that's one explanation. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak amar ho'il ve'rav guvlei. Because Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov was a greater rabbi. Okay, what does this mean? First of all, Rabbi Yehuda mentioned all over the Mishnah. So it's hard to say he wasn't such a great rabbi. He's mentioned way more times than Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. So what does it mean Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov was so great? Well, you might remember this, you might not. But Rabbi Eliezer, it's said about him that he is kav v'naki. Okay, kav is a measurement. Naki means clean. What does that mean? Well, it means kav is actually used often as not a very large measurement. So when they say he's kav v'naki, what it means is he has not a lot to say, but what he says is solid. Okay? He has, and therefore they chose him because he's known to be the one who really says it right and says it the most clear cut, and that's why they brought him. Okay? So it's a nice phrase about someone, kav v'naki, right? You don't say a lot, but what you say is spot on. Okay, moving on. Now we get to the women. So the Gemara says, my kamar. This seems to contradict, right? It seems to say women are obligated, but men do it, women don't. That's the way they understood it. So Amar Rav, even though it wasn't so clear what it means, B'Yisrael v'lo b'achirim. So Amar Rav Yehuda hachi kamar. He says this is what it means. Echad hanashim ve'echad nashim korbanan ta'un tenufa. Their korban. If a man brings a korban, a woman brings a korban, like shlamim, their korban has to have tenufa. But tenufa atzma b'Yisrael v'lo b'idei nashim. But the tenufa isn't done by the women. Why isn't it done by the women? Probably because they tried to limit women in the mikdash. It wasn't like, they just didn't feel like it was the right thing, I'm assuming. And we're going to get to that, Becky, in a minute. And I also assume if you put the hands of the kohen in the hands of the kohanim, the hands of the kohen in the hands of the owner, they didn't really want women involved in this. It's also possibly a reason. It's not so clear. But they say, we're going to see in a minute where they get it from a drasha, but the women don't do it. So now the question is, so what happens? So it seems like the kohen does it instead of the women, although I did see a source in the Koran, which I didn't have a chance to look enough and find the source for it, but it says it there, which again, I'm not sure where it comes from, because I tried looking and I didn't see it right away, but didn't do a good research, but that a husband can do it for the wife or some other man if she's not married. So, but certainly in the Rambam where I looked, it's very clear the kohen does it instead of the woman. Okay, now, what I want to say about this, just blanked on where I was going. Okay, I'll keep going and then hopefully it'll come back to me. But basically the tenufa, so we have this interesting situation where there's an obligation, so it's done, but it's not done with her. Okay. Tanu Rabanan. So now we're going to see the brighter where we get this from. B'nei Yisrael minifim ve'ein hagoyim minifim. Oh, that's what I wanted to get to, what Becky you were saying about there are two minifot, hanafot, that are done with the women. That's the sota, and if she's a nazir, she does tenufa on her korban. So there are two women who actually do hanafa. So this is talking about in the korban shlamim. Okay, this isn't talking about the women never do tenufa. Tanu Rabbanan. B'nei Yisrael minifim ve'ena goyim minifim. Okay, so here's a brayta that says the Jews, meaning males, do it, but not goyim. You'll see in a minute why they say B'nei Yisrael, because they're going to get it from the pasuk. B'nei Yisrael minifim ve'ena nashim minifot. So this comes to exclude non-Jews, and it comes to exclude women. Amar Rabbi Yossi. Matzinu. Okay, this is because the section of the shlamim where it talks about the tenufa starts out, the pasuk right before it says tenufa says daber al b'nei Yisrael limol. So from there it says b'nei Yisrael. They're going to say the b'nei Yisrael comes to exclude women. It comes to exclude the Gentiles. So Rabbi Yossi says matzinu shechalak hakatuv ben korban Yisrael lekorban goyim lekorban nashim bismicha. Sorry, I didn't read that right. Matzinu shechalak hakatuv ben korban Yisrael lekorban goyim lekorban nashim bismicha. Okay, it's a very confusing way it's written. What it really means here is, in the world of smicha, women are not obligated in smicha. Okay? Not women, not non-Jews. So what they're saying here is the Torah distinguished between the korban of Yisrael, between that to the korban of goyim and the korban of nashim, that neither of them needs smicha. Yachol nachlok b'tnufa. So by smicha, women are not obligated. So you might have thought women are not obligated here. Lo. Mali chalak b'smicha, shasmicha b'ba'alim. The reason there's no distinction is because smicha is only done by the owner. If the owner doesn't do it, nobody does it. Okay? So, smicha is not, now there, by the way, there's a famous sugya about women opting into mitzvot. Nashim somchot reshut. That's like one of the major sources for if you want to, you can. It's not like you can't do it. Nachlok b'tnufa, shatnufa b'kohanim. That's just a side point I'm pointing out. But the point is, in smicha, the smicha is by the owner, not the kohen. So, nachlok b'tnufa, shatufa b'kohanim, but the tenufa itself is done by the kohanim. So there's no reason to say that a korban of a woman isn't chayav in tenufa, even if we want to say she can't do it. Okay? Well, she doesn't do it, but the kohen can do it for her. The focus on the kohen, and therefore there's no reason to exempt women's korbanot, because the kohen's the one doing it. Im kemato, even though they do it together, right? But im kemato mulomar b'nei Yisrael. So why does it say b'nei Yisrael? Because they want to tell you, b'nei Yisrael minifim, ve'ena goyim minifim, b'nei Yisrael minifim, ve'ena nashim minifot. The b'nei Yisrael say they don't do it, but their korban is obligated. The obligation is on the korban, but the person doesn't do it. Tanya idach. B'nei Yisrael, ein li ela b'nei Yisrael. Another drasha on this b'nei Yisrael. This would seem to include only b'nei Yisrael, meaning those born Jews. Gerim v'avadim meshucharim minayin. Now they are included. How do we know we include converts and freed Canaanite slaves who become Jews when they're freed? Right? It's like a pseudo conversion. Talmud lomar hamakriv. Because it says hamakriv, that word includes anyone who's bringing a sacrifice. So now they say, okay, there's a pasuk, Daber b'nei Yisrael lemor hamakriv et zevach shlamav, which means anyone who's doing it, which would include that category of people. Now, they say, what do you mean? Hamakriv, maybe that means O eno ella kohen makriv. Okay, you're asking could be Gentiles? No, because what they're saying is there's one word that limits, that's b'nei Yisrael, and then there's another word which includes. So we're going to include something that's kind of in between. So now they say, right, in other words, that you might have thought isn't included b'nei Yisrael because they're not born Jews, but no, they are Jews, so they're obviously going to be included. Now they say, maybe hamakriv means the kohen who's makriv, right? What's the makriv? The one who offers. So offers could be the owner, offers could be the kohen, because the kohen's doing the hakrava, does the action. So maybe it's kohen makriv. So they say, no, because Shuomer Yadav Tiviana, because the next pasuk says, his hands will bring it. That's obviously the owner. Hare Baalim Amor. So it must be talking about the Baalim, but yet they say, even though hamakriv is talking about the owner, and it's including the gerim and the avadim, but still there's some mention of a kohen like alluded to in that word. So ha-ketzad, and then we get to this halacha that we saw before. It's another allusion to the fact that kohen miniach yadav tachi yedei ba'alim umenif, that there's a joint thing going on here. So it's another way of showing that the kohen is somehow mentioned here in the pasuk. But it really is used to say gerim and avadim meshucharim are included in this halacha. With that, we end for today. We'll continue this braita in tomorrow's daf. Okay, we started with Rabbi Shimon and the 3 limitations he had after he included at hamincha everything. Well, then he had to exclude a bunch of minchas that don't need hagasha. And then we ended with the hirim. The hirim is also not with a vessel, but with a komets, even though it didn't say it. We learned that from the other pasuk. Then we got to the list of what needs tenufa and doesn't need hagasha. We finished the list of also what needs both and what needs nothing, but that wasn't really our topic for today. We got in depth into, by the way, in Sugya Tana, also this week she discusses, if your Hebrew's good, the essence of this whole mitzvah of hagasha and hanafa. Okay, and just to remind you, if you haven't listened to Din and Daf, that was all about the shemen and the levona this week, and the no frills korban, the one that comes to mincha kote and sota with neither of them. Okay, but anyway, back to our topic. So we then had, how do we know that the asham and the log need to be waived? And that we saw, and then we thought, well, maybe that means they could be waived separately. No, it means they need to be waived together. How they get waived. Then we got to the bikurim, the derives of Yaakov. We said, what happened to Rabbi Yehuda? He also darshans it. We talked about the 2 different drashot, and then we explained why we chose Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. We had 2 possible answers. And then we got back to the women. How do we know the women do it? And within that, by the way, we made mention, because of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, we got to the Gzera Shava, which taught about how the kohen and the baalim both together have to do it. That was an aside there, although we got back to it a little more directly at the end of our daf. And we'll talk about tomorrow exactly how the waving is done. What foods goes on top of what? That's the first topic for tomorrow's daf. And then we got to the women, which was a kind of confusing topic, I would say, right? Where women's korbanot are obligated, but the women actually don't do it. I suggested possible reasons why women are out of this, right? It just didn't seem the right thing for them to have the women, even though that might be kind of bothersome, because also there are cases where women come, but maybe they didn't want it on a regular basis. Like every time a woman brings a korban shlamim. It's a good question also, by the way, how many women offer their own korbanot shlamim, I don't know. Right, we never really know all these details about how often these things were done. But anyway, it's interesting. They come to this middle ground where Bnei Israel is sort of limiting. On the other hand, the korban requires it. And then, like I said, seems pretty clear from the Rambam that the kohen is the one who does it. But it's not so clear from the footnote in the Kohen seems to say maybe someone could do it for her. You're asking about a yoledet. A yoledet is completely different because there's no hanafa. It's not a korban that needs hanafa. We're talking about waving, which is only in certain korbanot. And we did say there are korbanot of women where they do, which aren't mentioned here. They're mentioned in different Gemara. And with that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone. And then we got in the end to that last Rashav HaMakriv, which seems to include the people who are not born Jews but are Jews. And with that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom. Maybe a peaceful and quiet Shabbat. And B'sorot Tovot.